light and darkness, 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 light and darkness.
I've been leading the goddess pilgrimage to Crete now for more than 20 years, and it's really a labor of love for me, and Crete has become my second home. And the reason I chose to lead the goddess pilgrimage in Crete is because in Crete, unlike other places in Greece and other places in many other parts of the world, we can come into connection with a truly pre-patriarchal culture. The culture of ancient Crete was not warlike. It was not ruled by kings, and women and men were equal. Women were honored and took major roles in rituals and probably in decision-making for the community. And this is quite unusual to be able to find a culture that has been excavated with many museums, many archaeological sites, many beautiful artifacts that have been preserved, and no evidence of warfare, domination, rape, slavery, and pillage. And of course, these are the very things that are portrayed when you go to a Greek museum or to other Greek archaeological sites. For example, on the Parthenon in Athens, you see the defeat of the Amazon warriors by the Greek warriors. Earlier versions of the Parthenon depicted the slaying of the Titans, an earlier race of gods, by a later race of gods. Perseus holding the head of Medusa is a common image in the museums. And these are images of violence, pillage, and degradation and domination. And in ancient Crete, there's no evidence of that. The archaeologist who first excavated what he called the Palace of Knossos, an English gentleman named Sir Arthur Evans, was looking for the king who ruled in the palace that he claimed to have discovered. And although he excavated for many decades, he never found an image of a bearded king with his staff sitting on a throne, or any images of armies being greeted by the king, or any graves of warriors during the period before 1450 BC, when the Minoan culture was destroyed. And this is, of course, not unusual in the history of the world, because I believe that prior to the rise of patriarchy at different times in different places, people did live in much greater harmony with each other and with nature, and without institutionalized domination created by war and kings. But for us to find such a culture in Europe and to find it well preserved in the archaeological record is quite unusual. And that's why I've chosen to devote my life to leading goddess pilgrimages in Crete.
One of the things that I noticed about Crete was the land. I mean, especially the mountains. So the landscape and the land itself also seems to hold something quite ancient and profound. So the land, it seems the land is a very important part of your pilgrimages as well, when I look at the images and read some of the accounts from people.
Yes, the land is a very important part of our pilgrimage, both the land and our own connection to the land through our bodies. I believe that in ancient Crete, the goddess was not a transcendent principle who lived primarily or only in the sky and dealt with, rebirth or life after death. The goddess was very much immanent or present within the landscape and within the lives and bodies of the people. Yeah. I believe that the Mountain Mother is one of the most prominent images of the goddess in the ancient Cretan religion. And the Mountain Mother would be personified in the mountains that you could see, the highest mountain that you could see from wherever your community was. And Wangari Maathai, who won the Nobel Prize for Peace and is a Kenyan, lived in Kenya, she wrote about sacred Mount Kenya, that the people considered the mountain to be sacred because the clouds formed on the mountain. The rain came down on the mountains. The rain created streams and rivers that flowed down the mountain, and these provided water for the people to drink and nourished their fields. And I think this was very much the same case in Crete, that the highest mountain was the place where the source of life was personified, both as the enduring presence that surrounds you and protects you, and also as the source of the water that nurtured life. And the culture in ancient Crete actually began in the Neolithic period. And one of the things that I talk about on the tour is the fact that most anthropologists and archaeologists will concede, as one of my colleagues said, that women probably invented agriculture. And they concede it, that is, they acknowledge it, and then they move quickly on and don't talk about it at all.
Yes.
But in fact, agriculture was one of the great revolutions in history, comparable to the Industrial Revolution. And anthropologists and archaeologists believe that women created agriculture because in most traditional cultures, women were the gatherers, whereas men were the hunters. And it makes sense that those who were gathering the seeds, the nuts, the berries, the acorns, would be the ones who prepared the food in the campsite, and then would have noticed the next year they came to this campsite that if they dropped some seeds or nuts, they might have come up as little plants the next year. And gradually, over a long period of time, women would have been the ones who understood that they could drop the seeds purposely, and then they would grow. And then, of course, over trial and error, discovering that if they planted the seeds, and if they planted the seeds in a place that would be nourished by water and many other factors, this was how agriculture was developed. And a lot of times people say the goddess was simply a fertility figure, talking about the human birth and perhaps connecting that to the growth of crops. But it's much more than that. The goddess represented the wisdom of women, not only their intuition, but also their intelligence. She was not just, as the Jungians like to say, the unconscious. She was also the conscious. And some of the Pueblo Indians talk about her as thought woman. And very much so this would have been true in ancient Crete as well, that it wasn't just the body that gives birth, but also the consciousness of women that understood the connection between the powers of birth in the female body and the powers of birth in the earth, which they personified.
So as you speak, I can really hear your love and passion for this, and for this, the connection you have with Crete. It's obviously called you very strongly and engaged you in a way that's quite profound. And then the women who come with you, I imagine, have the same, you are the bridge for them to have that sort of experience as well.
Yes, the women who come on the tour often say that, they had heard about the goddess, they had even studied about the goddess, some of them were even participating in goddess rituals. Many of them were, but many not. Many had just learned about it through reading, and of course some come along with friends without a great deal of preparation. But for all of them, I think what happens on the tour is a profound shift in their consciousness. Whereas before they understood, or they thought, or they hoped that there was a time before patriarchy and before women were told that our bodies were dirty and were kept down, and rape was a prominent fact in our lives. They had the idea that there was something like that before patriarchy, but after being in Crete for 2 weeks, they believed that it was really true. Mm-hmm. One of the women who came on the tour used the metaphor. She felt like she'd had a blood transfusion. Yeah. That is, everything inside of her was shifting. Yes. Because although she was a feminist when she came on the tour, after the tour, she had the profound realization that things that she had considered, well, if not normal, at least inevitable, simply were not natural and were not necessary, and were not the way that society had to be organized.
It's a profound gift, and it sounds like what happens is that they experience it in an embodied way. They know it in their bodies.
Yes, they know it in their bodies and in their minds. And part of the tour, as you were asking before, involves a fair amount of physical exercise. We have to walk up the sides of mountains and down into caves. This is very important because it's really important that knowledge takes roots not only in our minds but in our bodies. Mm. And for many of us who live in the modern Western world, rituals often take place in somebody's living room with candles lit, fire perhaps going in the hearth, but they're not really taking place in nature. And I believe that our ancestors found the sacred in nature. That's why in Europe it was the old oak tree or the sacred holy well where they held the rituals. And similarly in Crete, the cave was understood to be the womb of Mother Earth, and the mountain, as I said, the mountain mother, the surrounding presence that nurtures and protects us. And going into a cave is particularly profound. I know a lot of people, before they come on the tour, they think, oh, I don't know if I want to go into a cave. I might be scared, it's dark, it might be dangerous. And of course, these are the things that we've been taught in our culture, that we've been taught to fear the dark. But our ancestors believed that the cave was the womb of our Mother Earth. And by going into the cave, we could enter into her mysteries. And particularly in entering into the womb in ritual space, we connect with the place where we were born, the place where we can be reborn and transformed. And on the pilgrimage, women actually test their physical body strength. It's not that way. It's a terribly, it's not, you don't have to be a great athlete, but simply to go into a cave, go into the dark, and then having to pull yourself up on some rocks and slide down on some others. You test your physical strength, and the knowledge that you gain then in the ritual is also about feeling not only mentally strong and spiritually strong, but also knowing your physical power as it's embodied in your body. And I think this is really important.
Yeah, I think it's important too. When I was in Crete this year, I was using my GPS to drive around, and through some magic of the place, I was continually taken to the top of mountains where I didn't necessarily intend to go. I was looking for an obscure archaeological site or something else, and the GPS would recalibrate. And at one point we were driving along what looked like a goat track over the top of a mountain. And I think by the time this happened 2 or 3 times, like, okay, I get it. This is about the mountains. It's about the mountains. That's what I have to get here. And
yes.
And there's that sort of magic in the place that I've experienced in Bali before, where the place itself has an intention. It's which isn't necessarily consistent with my intention of where I think I'm going to go. And I found that quite remarkable in Crete. It was very palpable, very strong.
Yes, and it's interesting that the archaeologists often say that the ancient Cretans worshipped on mountaintops because the king went up there to survey his realm.
All
And
right.
as I said, there's no evidence that there was a king in ancient Crete, but they continue to hold on to these old stereotypes, as Maria Gimbutas called them, indolent assumptions that other cultures must have been like the cultures that we're more familiar with. But Alice Walker has a beautiful poem called We Have a Beautiful Mother,
Yes.
and we read that on the top of the mountain. And I think it's much, much more likely that people went up to the mountaintop in order to appreciate the beauty of their mother, which is all the beauty of the earth.
Yeah.
And for example, from the top of Mount Euctus, where we read that poem, you can see the sea, you can see the surrounding mountains, you can see the fertile fields below you, dotted with olives and grapevines, and where the tomatoes and other vegetables are also grown. And of course, they didn't have the tomato in ancient Crete. That's an American introduction. But they would have had the same olive groves, the same grapevines, and the same fertile fields that you can see from the mountaintops. And of course, when you go up to the mountains, you're also in the presence of the sheep and the goats.
Yes.
And those were animals that were also nurtured by the ancient Cretans. So the mountaintop is not a place for a king to survey his realm. It's a place where we can appreciate the great bounty of our Mother Earth.
One of the things I noticed in the Heraclean Museum was that they didn't often use the G word.
Yes.
And having read your work, I was quite surprised, because I think I expected that the whole of Crete really would be like you. And I was looking at these human-shaped vessels and female icons and various names, anything but goddess, really. And
yes, the museum in Heraklion previously didn't have very much explanation at all, and recently it has been remodeled, and all the exhibits have been redesigned. And unfortunately, there are two trends going on in modern-day archaeology. One is that there is a serious reaction against the goddess and against Maria Gimbutas. And I've heard that this is happening also in the museum in Ankara, where they have the artifacts of Çatalhöyük, as well as in the museums in Malta, where they have the evidence of the ancient goddesses, that the word goddess is being used less and less, and the importance of the goddesses being downplayed. Secondly, there's a trend in archaeology to focus on the material rather than the spiritual, and to talk about everyday life rather than talking about religion and spirituality, the goddess, their belief system. And these two trends are both expressed in the new design of the Heraklion Museum. I actually have no problem with focusing on the material aspects of life, because for me, one of the things that I think is important is that the goddess did not symbolize simply a spiritual entity, but she symbolized, as I said, the powers of women to give birth, the power of the earth to give birth, and also I think the goddess in Crete in all of old Europe was very much tied in not only with women's invention of agriculture, but with women's invention of weaving and pottery making as well. So there's always a material element. What's interesting is you go into the Heraklion Museum and it says people, they start with the Neolithic and they say people settled down and they discovered agriculture.
Yes.
And they discovered pottery,
Yeah.
and they discovered weaving. But it never says women were the most likely ones who understood these processes and invented them. I was in a museum in northern Greece, in Thessaloniki, a couple of years ago, and there was a huge exhibit on the Neolithic. And I was the only person in the museum, on that floor of the museum. And there were two guards standing there. They were both middle-aged women. And I was getting more and more upset because it talked about the Neolithic in much more detail than the Heracleon Museum does. And it kept on saying man invented this, man invented that. And it never talked about the role of women. And finally got to almost the last case in a very, very large room. And it said, oh, and there's some little images of men, women, and animals, and we don't know what they mean. And that was what they had to say about the goddess statues, small statues called figurines sometimes. Similarly, in the Heracleon. Oh, and by the way, while I was there, I was getting more and more angry, and finally I went up to one of the women guards and I said, "Did you know that women invented all of these things?" And I started talking to her about it, and she was amazed. She said, "No, I've never heard that before." And of course, the museum isn't teaching her that. Neither is the school in Greece or in anywhere else in the world. In the Heracleon Museum, then you have about 4 or 5 cases that show the invention of agriculture, pottery, and weaving. And then back in the corner, they have one case dedicated to I think they call it the figurines. I'm not sure what term they use. But they go on to say these are male, female, and indefinite, and sometimes animals. And they must have symbolized something, but we don't understand what. Now, if I were designing a museum, I would say this is a culture that originated in the Neolithic when women invented agriculture, weaving, and pottery. These were mysteries of transformation that were understood to be connected to the basic mysteries of the universe, which are birth, death, and regeneration, which are symbolized in the female body, and that's why they worshipped the source of life as Mother Earth or as the goddess. But of course, you don't find anything like that in the museum. And in the current Heracleon Museum, you don't even see the snake goddesses until you've gone through 4 or 5, 6, I think 6 or 7 other rooms. And I would suspect that a lot of people get tired before they even get to them, unless they know that they have to look for them.
Yeah. I did find that in Anatolia there was a lot more, in the museums, there was a lot more acknowledgement of goddess and of the centrality of goddess. I'm talking really about the museum in Selçuk. Selçuk's an interesting place because there's like a little pocket where there's an honouring of the goddess in a different sort of way. Even in the shops, with the icons in the shops, the shop seller who was selling the goddess statues was saying, these are the ones that are important, these are the ones that really mean something, but the tourists won't buy them, but these are the ones that are significant. He was
So that's good to know, because I'm sure you know that the archaeologists who've been re-excavating at Çatalhöyük are part of the trend of downplaying or denying the importance of the goddess in the Neolithic religion at Çatalhöyük.
Yes.
So anyway, it's an ongoing struggle, and I think that we're partly dealing with a backlash against the idea that our culture, namely the modern Western culture, is not the highest culture that ever evolved on the face of the earth. And it was quite all right for Arthur Evans to say that the ancient Minoan culture worshipped the mother goddess. She was personified within nature. As long as he continued on to say that kings ruled and, the culture more or less developed into the Mycenaean, which was the earliest form of the ancient Greek culture, and then it continued on. But what Maria Gimbutas said that was much more revolutionary was that it was not a development of one culture into another, but rather a hostile takeover of one culture by another, and that the earlier culture was peaceful and egalitarian, and the later culture was male-dominant and violent. And then she raised the question as to which culture is the one that would provide the greatest healing in our time. And the clear implication of her writing is that we need to go back to the values of the earlier culture. This was what I think is threatening. And of course, she not only said that, but other people were saying it at the same time, especially feminists involved in the rediscovery of the goddess. And this then these archaeologists were confronted by women who were saying, we need to go back to the goddess and we need to go back to the values of the earlier cultures. And this is profoundly threatening, of course, to anyone whose livelihood and life's work has been based on defending and promoting Western culture as the highest culture in the history of the world. And of course, in the case of archaeology, this focuses on ancient Greece being the foundation of rational thinking and democracy. And any suggestion that that culture is not the highest culture in the world is profoundly threatening. And I think this is the reason why there's been a backlash against the Buddhists, against the goddess, and against anyone who wants to argue that there was a time when patriarchy, domination, rape, slavery, and war were not inevitable in human culture.
The Museum of Cycladic Art Brutus's book on a stand in the front of the shop.
Well, blessed be. I'm glad to hear that. The Buddhist felt herself, she was alive when the backlash started happening, and she apparently said to Charlene Spretnik and others that the validity of her work would be recognized in time. And I hope that will be true.
On a more personal level, what are the challenges women who come to these journeys? What sort of challenges do they encounter in themselves?
One of the things I talk about on the first night of the pilgrimage is Victor Turner's idea that as you enter into a pilgrimage, you step across a threshold. You leave your ordinary life behind, whether that's getting up in the morning at 6 o'clock and having a shower and having a cup of coffee and rushing off to work, or getting the children ready for work, or whatever else your ordinary routines are. You leave that behind and you step across the threshold into what he calls liminal space. And liminal space is non-ordinary space where your ordinary expectations of how life goes along with its ordinary rhythms has been, you've left that behind. And so most people who set off on a pilgrimage set off because they're looking for something. There's something missing in their ordinary lives that they hope to find, or to find reinforced through visiting a sacred place. And so we've talked a lot about the sacred place part of the tour already. Another important part of pilgrimage is what Victor Turner calls communitas. And if we think about the Canterbury Tales and how they were on their way to a pilgrimage site, but on the way they told their stories. And in telling their stories, they revealed why they were on the pilgrimage. And that's a big part of our tour as well. Most nights we have an hour to an hour and a half of sharing, where we simply are free to express what has moved us during the day, how that connects back to our quest and our lives, without judgment and without criticism. And we begin that meeting saying a simple affirmation, which is, I am whole, I am here. And then I would say my name in Greek, I am whole, I am here, I am Carolina. And then the group repeats back, you are whole, you are here, you are Carolina, 3 times or 2 times. And so getting to your question, what are the challenges that people face along the tour? First of all, people face the challenge of simply being in a foreign country, having traveled, maybe being a bit jet lagged when they arrive, not knowing the language, not knowing how to get from here to there. And then on a larger sense, setting off on a pilgrimage, you're willing to be open to revelation, to new insights that may shape the foundations of your life. And then, of course, because our cultures have become rather sedentary, for a lot of the women, simply the physical exercise is a challenge as well. And altogether, I would say that most of the women on the tour are challenged in one way or another, whether they get lost trying to find their way back to the hotel, or whether they have a hard time getting up the mountainside, or it takes longer than the others to find their way in the cave. And all of these things, I think, sometimes people say, well, give us more time to sleep or give us more time to process. And actually, I think it's really important when you're on a pilgrimage in a way to not get enough sleep sometimes, not have enough time to process, because part of what happens if you're going to be really open to a profound revelation is you have to give up control. And you have to give up determining for yourself what's going to happen in your life. And you talked a minute ago about how for you it was finding yourself on the top of a mountain when that wasn't where you were trying to go. For me, on my first pilgrimage, I had a very profound experience of losing control. And I've written about this in my book under its original title, which is The Serpentine Path. And on the first tour, I thought I had everything, quote unquote, under control before I left, the day before I was about to leave for the tour. And a series of things happened. I had I guess you would call it a breakdown or a breakthrough in my therapy group the night before I left. Due to a strike, I wasn't able to get a taxi, and I missed my airplane, and on and on and on. Till towards the end of the tour, I even lost my voice as the tour leader. And this was actually a very profound learning experience for me because, like many other people in our culture, probably most of us, I had been raised with what the psychologist Alice Miller calls a poisonous pedagogy of control. I was told by my father especially, control yourself a lot during my life. And I learned in an unconscious way to feel that I had to control everything or things might fall apart. And although I wouldn't have called myself an overly controlling person, I don't have OCD. I have a messy room a lot of the time. I don't do the dishes as soon as I finish my meal. But on another level, I was feeling that I had to control everything in my life or things would fall apart. And so when control was taken from me, and the final manifestation of that was that I couldn't even speak, I was forced to confront that. And after the tour, I actually continued being unable to speak for almost 2 weeks, to speak very much for almost 2 weeks. And that was a time of profound transformation, symbolized by going into the darkness of a cave, which I also did on the tour. And through that process, I came to what for me was a very profound revelation and realization, and that is that most things in life cannot be controlled, and one needs to accept that. And as soon as you accept that, you start discovering many gifts that have been there all along that you'd been unable to recognize. For example, for me, I was at that time focused on, I have to find my true love. I have to find a life partner. And I was suffering a lot of disappointment because that wasn't happening. And as soon as I gave up needing to have that so badly, I started recognizing that I was widely loved every moment of my life, whether it was by my mother or by my girlfriends or by my next door neighbor or by the person who smiled at me when I came into their shop every day. And so for me, the process of giving up control opened me to seeing that there are so many things that are freely given that you don't have to create for yourself. You don't have to make them happen. You just have to acknowledge them and be grateful for them. So I think on some level,
Thank you.
many of the people in the tour undergo something like that.
Thank you. That's
Perhaps
just
not
just very beautifully shared. Thank you. That I think that says very much about what the experience of pilgrimage is, and in a deeply personal way. And I really appreciate you sharing that. Thank you.
And just to add to that, from that sort of realization, I understood that the basic gesture in the Minoan religion must have been the pouring of libations and the offerings of the first fruits and the seeds on the altar. And the basic gesture, in other words, is gratitude. Gratitude to the earth who has given us life, giving back to her what she has given to us, and then sharing it freely with others.
Light and darkness, light and darkness.